The morning of December 16th, 1944, began like any other quiet winter day in the Ardennes forest. Sergeant William Billy Thompson of the 106th Infantry Division pulled his wool coat tighter against the bitter Belgian cold as he peered through the frost-covered windows of the small farmhouse that served as his company's forward observation post. The forest stretched endlessly before him, snow-laden branches creating an almost peaceful tableau that belied the war raging across Europe. "Quiet as a church mouse out there, Sarge," whispered Private First Class Michael O'Brien, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The 20-year-old from Boston had been complaining about the cold for weeks. But Thompson knew the kid was tougher than he looked. They all had to be. Thompson nodded, but something felt different about this silence. In his 18 months of combat across France and into the Low Countries, he had learned to trust his instincts. The Germans had been unusually quiet for the past week. Their usual patrol activities along the Siegfried Line mysteriously absent. Intelligence reports suggested the enemy was regrouping, perhaps planning a withdrawal, but Thompson's gut told him otherwise. The 106th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Golden Lions, had only recently arrived in this sector, relieving battle-weary veterans who desperately needed rest. Most of Thompson's men were green replacements, fresh from stateside training camps, their faces still bearing the soft look of youth unmarked by combat. They had been told this was a quiet sector, a place where new units could ease into combat operations without facing the intense fighting scene elsewhere along the Western Front. As referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive work, Band of Brothers and various wartime dispatches, the Ardennes was considered a secondary front where inexperienced divisions could gain valuable combat experience under relatively safe conditions. Captain James Mitchell, the company commander, had briefed his officers the previous evening about maintaining defensive positions while preparing for what High Command believed would be a relatively uneventful winter. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were resting and refitting near Reims, France, after their grueling campaigns in Normandy and Operation Market Garden. The 4th Armored Division was positioned further south, while the veteran 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held adjacent sectors along the German border. Thompson checked his watch 0530 hours. In another hour, he would send O'Brien and Corporal Robert Davies on their routine morning patrol through the snow-covered trails that wound deeper into the forest. These patrols had become almost monotonous, encountering nothing more threatening than the occasional deer or abandoned German equipment left behind during their earlier retreats. The farmhouse creaked in the wind, its ancient timbers protesting against the harsh winter weather. Inside, a small fire burned in the stone hearth, providing just enough warmth to keep their weapons from freezing. Thompson had learned the hard way during the fighting in the Hirchen forest that cold weather could make rifles jam and ammunition unreliable. He insisted his men keep their weapons close to their bodies whenever possible. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to creep across the snow-covered landscape, casting long shadows through the bare trees. The beauty of the scene was almost surreal, a winter wonderland that seemed impossibly removed from the mechanized death that had swept across Europe for more than 5 years. Yet Thompson knew that this peaceful facade could shatter in an instant, transforming their quiet sector into a hellish battlefield where survival would depend on training, luck, and the bonds of brotherhood forged in foxholes and under enemy fire. At exactly 0530 hours on December 16th, the tranquil morning shattered like broken glass. The first German artillery shells began falling with devastating precision across the entire Ardennes front, their thunderous explosions echoing through the forest valleys and sending shockwaves through the frozen ground. Sergeant Thompson felt the farmhouse shake violently as nearby impacts sent dirt and debris raining down from the ceiling. "Take cover," Thompson shouted, diving behind an overturned table as Private O'Brien scrambled toward the cellar entrance. The bombardment intensified with each passing minute, transforming from sporadic shelling into a concentrated barrage. Unlike anything the inexperienced soldiers had encountered during their brief time in combat, through the chaos, Motan could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar mixed with the deeper rumble of heavy artillery. The Germans were using everything they had: 88mm guns, 150mm howitzers, and multiple rocket launchers that created an almost continuous wall of explosions. Windows throughout the farmhouse exploded inward, showering the interior with glass fragments and letting the bitter December wind howl through the building. Captain Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio, barely audible above the din of exploding shells. "All positions report. We're under heavy bombardment across the entire sector. This is not a diversionary attack, repeat. This is a major offensive." The bombardment continued for over 2 hours, systematically targeting American positions, communication lines, and supply routes. Thompson huddled in the farmhouse cellar with his remaining squad members, listening to the earth-shaking impacts that seemed to walk methodically across the landscape above them. Dust cascaded from the stone ceiling with each nearby explosion, and the air grew thick with smoke and cordite. When the shelling finally ceased around 00:00 hours, an eerie silence fell over the forest. Thompson cautiously climbed the cellar stairs, his rifle ready, and peered through what remained of the farmhouse windows. What he saw chilled him more than the December cold. Hundreds of ghostly figures in white winter camouflage were moving through the trees, advancing steadily toward American positions. The German offensive, later known as Operation Watch on the Rhine, had begun in earnest. Elite Waffen-SS's divisions, supported by regular Wehrmacht units and the last reserves of German armor, were pushing through the Ardennes with a ferocity that caught Allied commanders completely off guard. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and other veteran formations were spearheading the attack, seeking to split Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. Thompson quickly gathered his surviving squad members, O'Brien, Davies, and 3 others who had made it through the bombardment unscathed. Their orders were simple: delay the German advance while falling back to prepared secondary positions. But as Thompson looked at the overwhelming enemy force approaching through the forest, he realized their small unit would be fighting for survival rather than executing any organized withdrawal. The sound of tank engines grew louder, accompanied by the mechanical clanking of tracked vehicles moving through the snow. German Panzer IV and Panther tanks emerged from the tree line, their long guns traversing menacingly as they searched for targets. Behind the armor, infantry companies advanced in extended formation, their white winter uniforms making them nearly invisible against the snow-covered ground. "Fall back to the secondary position," Thompson ordered, knowing that staying in the farmhouse would mean certain death or capture. The men gathered their essential equipment and began a fighting withdrawal through the forest, using the natural cover of fallen logs and rocky outcroppings to mask their movement. Behind them, the farmhouse that had been their home for the past month disappeared in a ball of flame as German tank fire found its target. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. And for Thompson and thousands of other Allied soldiers scattered across the Ardennes, the next several weeks would test their courage, endurance, and determination in ways they had never imagined possible. By December 17th, the full scope of the German offensive became horrifyingly clear to the scattered American units fighting desperately across the Ardennes. Sergeant Thompson's squad had managed to reach their secondary defensive position as a series of hastily dug foxholes on a ridge overlooking the main road to Bastogne, but they found themselves increasingly isolated as German forces flowed around their flanks like a relentless tide. The temperature had dropped to well below freezing, and the men huddled in their foxholes with inadequate winter clothing, sharing body heat and rationing their dwindling supplies of ammunition. Thompson had lost radio contact with Captain Mitchell's headquarters during the chaotic withdrawal, leaving his small unit completely cut off from higher command. The only information they received came from occasional stragglers who stumbled through their position-wounded soldiers, from other units who painted a grim picture of collapsed defenses and overwhelming German superiority. Private O'Brien, his face pale with cold and exhaustion, pointed toward the valley below, where a seemingly endless column of German vehicles was moving westward. Panzer tanks, half-tracks filled with infantry, and horse-drawn artillery pieces stretched as far as the eye could see. all heading toward the critical road junction at Bastogne. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, a display of military power that represented Germany's final desperate gamble to turn the tide of war in Europe. "How many of them are there, Sarge?" whispered Corporal Davies, his voice barely audible above the wind whistling through the bare tree branches. Thompson studied the enemy column through his binoculars, trying to make sense of the unit markings and equipment. He could identify elements from at least 3 different German divisions, including the feared 1st SS Panzer Division, whose black uniforms and death's head insignia struck fear into Allied soldiers throughout the war. According to military historians like Charles MacDonald, whose detailed accounts in A Time for Trumpets document this phase of the battle, over 200,000 German troops participated in the initial assault, supported by nearly 600 tanks and assault guns. The attacking force represented the largest concentration of German military power assembled since the early days of the war. Drawing units from across the crumbling Reich for one final offensive push, Thompson made a difficult decision. Rather than attempting a futile attack against overwhelming odds, his squad would remain hidden and report German movements to any Allied forces they could contact. This intelligence would prove invaluable to American commanders trying to understand the scope and direction of the enemy offensive. The men settled deeper into their frozen foxholes, covering themselves with white sheets and blankets to blend with the snowy landscape. As night fell, on December 17th, the temperature plummeted even further, and Thompson watched his men begin to show signs of serious cold weather injury. Frostbite was becoming a constant threat, and several soldiers were developing the glassy-eyed stare that indicated the onset of hypothermia. They had no medical supplies beyond basic first aid kits. Their rations were already running dangerously low. The sounds of battle echoed through the forests throughout the night, distant artillery fire, the rattle of machine guns, and the occasional burst of small arms fire as scattered American units engaged advancing German forces. Flares illuminated the sky periodically, casting eerie shadows across the snow-covered landscape and revealing the magnitude of the disaster unfolding. Across the Ardennes front, despite their desperate situation, Thompson's men maintained their discipline and fighting spirit. They had been trained as soldiers, and they would fulfill their duty regardless of the odds against them. As O'Brien quietly cleaned his rifle by moonlight and Davies checked their remaining ammunition, Thompson felt a surge of pride in these young Americans who had traveled thousands of miles from home to fight against tyranny in the forests of Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge would ultimately become known as the largest land battle fought by American forces during World War II. But for Thompson and his men, it was simply about surviving another frozen night while surrounded by enemies who showed no quarter to captured American soldiers. December 19th brought news that would define the entire Battle of the Bulge. The strategic crossroads town of Bastogne was completely surrounded by German forces, with the 101st Airborne Division and elements of other units trapped inside the perimeter. Sergeant Thompson's squad, still hiding in their frozen foxholes on the ridge, watched as German artillery began systematically pounding the distant town, sending columns of black smoke rising into the gray winter sky. The situation had deteriorated rapidly across the entire Ardennes front. Major General Anthony McAuliffe, temporary commander of the 101st Airborne, had received an ultimatum from German forces demanding the surrender of Bastogne. His legendary one-word response, "nuts," would become synonymous with American determination during the battle. But Thompson and his men knew nothing of this dramatic exchange as they struggled to survive in the frozen wilderness. German patrols were now actively searching the forest for scattered American units, forcing Thompson to move his squad deeper into the woods to avoid capture. They had observed several groups of American prisoners being marched past their position, their hands raised in surrender, their faces bearing the hollow expressions of defeated soldiers. Thompson was determined that his men would not share that fate, regardless of the odds against them. The cold had become their most dangerous enemy. Private O'Brien was showing advanced signs of frostbite in his feet, while Corporal Davies had developed a persistent cough that produced small amounts of blood, a sure sign of pneumonia developing in the freezing conditions. Thompson himself felt the lethargy and confusion that indicated his own body temperature was dropping to dangerous levels. But he forced himself to remain alert and focused on keeping his men alive. On the morning of December 22nd, they witnessed one of the most remarkable sights of the entire war. Despite heavy overcast conditions that had prevented Allied air support for nearly a week, the clouds suddenly began to break, revealing patches of blue sky. Within hours, the air filled with the distinctive drone of aircraft engines as hundreds of American transport planes appeared overhead, dropping desperately needed supplies to the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, as documented in wartime reports from the Army Air Forces. Operation Repulse involved over 240 transport aircraft, making supply drops under extremely hazardous conditions, with many planes flying through heavy anti-aircraft fire to deliver ammunition, medical supplies, and food to the surrounded American forces. Thompson watched through his binoculars as colorful parachutes blossomed in the sky above Bastogne, carrying the supplies that would enable the garrison to continue their heroic defense. German fighter aircraft appeared sporadically, attempting to interfere with the supply drops. But Allied escort fighters drove them off in fierce aerial combat that left contrails streaking across the winter sky. The sight of those supply drops had an almost electric effect on Thompson's men. For the first time in days, they saw tangible evidence that they had not been forgotten, that the larger Allied war machine was still functioning and fighting back against the German offensive. O'Brien actually smiled for the first time since the battle began, and Davies straightened up in his foxhole with renewed determination. That afternoon, they heard the distant sound of artillery fire coming from the south, not the German guns that had been pounding Allied positions for nearly a week, but the distinctive report of American 105mm howitzers. General George Patton's Third Army was fighting its way north toward Bastogne, attempting to break through German lines and relieve the surrounded garrison. Thompson knew they were witnessing history in the making. The Battle of the Bulge was reaching its critical phase, with the outcome of the entire offensive hanging in the balance. Whether the German gamble would succeed or fail depended largely on whether American forces could hold Bastogne long enough for reinforcements to arrive. His small squad, freezing and nearly forgotten in their forest hideout, were playing their own small but vital role in this larger drama by continuing to resist and survive against overwhelming odds. December 26th marked a turning point that would be remembered as one of the most dramatic moments in American military history. Sergeant Thompson's squad is now reduced to just 4 effective soldiers after Private O'Brien succumbed to severe hypothermia during the previous night. Heard the unmistakable sound of American Sherman tanks approaching from the south. The deep rumble of their engines, so different from the higher-pitched whine of German panzers, sent a surge of hope through the exhausted survivors, through the bare trees. Thompson glimpsed the distinctive white star markings of the 4th Armored Division as General George Patton's spearhead units fought their way through the final German defensive positions surrounding Bastogne. The relief of the besieged town represented a masterpiece of rapid military movement. Patton had pivoted his entire Third Army 90 degrees in the middle of winter, moving over 100,000 men and their equipment in less than a week to strike the southern flank of the German offensive. The sound of intense fighting grew closer as American tanks engaged German panzers in a series of running battles through the snow-covered hills south of Bastogne. Thompson could hear the distinctive crack of high-velocity tank guns, the rapid chatter of machine gun fire, and the occasional explosion as ammunition stores or fuel tanks were hit. Black smoke columns rose from burning vehicles on both sides, creating a pall that hung over the battlefield like a funeral shroud. Corporal Davies, now the senior surviving member of Thompson's original squad, pointed toward a group of figures moving through the forest approximately 200 yards from their position. Through his binoculars, Thompson could see they were American soldiers, members of the 37th Tank Battalion, advancing cautiously through the trees, their weapons ready for contact with any remaining German forces in the area. Thompson made the decision to reveal their position, despite the risk that German snipers might still be operating in the vicinity. Using a small signal mirror to reflect sunlight, the first they had seen in over a week, he flashed the recognition signal. toward the advancing American unit. Within minutes, a squad of infantry accompanied by a Sherman tank was moving carefully toward their foxholes. "Identify yourselves," called out a lieutenant whom Thompson recognized as belonging to the 4th Armored Division. Thompson responded with the proper challenge and password, then slowly emerged from his concealed position with his remaining men. The relief on their faces was matched by the surprise of their rescuers, who had not expected to find any survivors from the units that had been overrun during the initial German assault, as referenced in official Army records and post-war interviews. With 4th Armored Division veterans, many isolated American units were discovered during the advance toward Bastogne. Having survived for over 10 days behind enemy lines through courage, resourcefulness, and sheer determination to continue fighting, the lieutenant, whose name was Robert Zimmerman from Chicago, Illinois, quickly assessed Thompson's group and called for medical evacuation. Davies was barely conscious from pneumonia, while the other 2 surviving soldiers showed severe signs of frostbite and malnutrition. Thompson himself had lost over 20 pounds during their ordeal, and his uniform hung loosely on his gaunt frame. "You men have done your duty and more," Lieutenant Zimmerman said as medics began treating the survivors. The 101st held Bastogne. Patton broke through the German lines, and now we're pushing these bastards back where they came from. The Bulge is finished. Hitler's last gamble has failed. As Thompson was loaded onto a stretcher for evacuation to a field hospital, he looked back toward the ridge where his squad had spent 10 days fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. The snow-covered foxholes that had been their home now seemed impossibly small and vulnerable. Hardly adequate shelter for grown men during one of the worst winters in European memory. Yet they had held their position, maintained their discipline, continued to serve as soldiers even when cut off from all support and facing certain death or capture. The relief of Bastogne represented more than just a tactical victory. It demonstrated that American soldiers, when properly led and motivated, could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles through courage, determination, and an unshakable belief in their cause. January 3rd, 1945, found Sergeant Thompson recovering in a field hospital. Near Luxembourg City, his frostbitten hands wrapped in bandages while he listened to radio reports describing the complete collapse of the German offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, which had begun with such devastating success for Hitler's forces, was ending in disaster for the Wehrmacht as Allied counterattacks pushed the exhausted German units back toward their starting positions along the Siegfried Line. Thompson learned that the cost of the German gamble had been catastrophic. Over 100,000 German casualties, including many of their most experienced officers and non-commissioned officers, had been suffered during the 6-week battle. More critically, the offensive had consumed the last strategic reserves of the German army, along with most of their remaining fuel supplies and ammunition stocks. Hitler's final attempt to split the Western Allies and force a negotiated peace had instead hastened the end of the Third Reich. Corporal Davies, covering in the hospital bed next to Thompson, had survived his bout with pneumonia, but would require several months of recuperation before returning to duty. The other 2 members of their squad had been evacuated to hospitals in England for treatment of severe frostbite that would leave them with permanent disabilities. Private O'Brien, who had died during their ordeal in the forest, had been posthumously awarded the Silver Star for his courage under fire during the initial German assault. The human cost of the Battle of the Bulge was staggering on both sides. American casualties totaled over 80,000 men, including nearly 20,000 killed in action. Entire divisions had been shattered during the fighting, with some units losing more than 70% of their strength. The 106th Infantry Division, Thompson's original unit, had been virtually destroyed during the initial German assault, with thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured during the chaotic first days of the offensive. Yet, the battle had also demonstrated the remarkable resilience and fighting spirit of American forces when faced with overwhelming odds. Units like the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne had become legendary for their refusal to surrender despite being completely surrounded and outnumbered. Individual soldiers and small groups, like Thompson's squad, continued to fight effectively even when cut off from all support and facing seemingly certain death or capture. As documented in Stephen Ambrose's Citizen Soldiers and other comprehensive accounts of the battle, the Ardennes offensive marked a turning point in American military confidence and capability, proving that hastily trained citizen soldiers could stand toe-to-toe with veteran German units and emerge victorious. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, had managed the crisis with exceptional skill, rapidly shifting reserves to threatened areas while maintaining overall strategic coherence despite the initial chaos. The decision to hold Bastogne at all costs, combined with Patton's brilliant flanking movement from the south, had turned what began as a potential disaster into a decisive Allied victory that shortened the war in Europe by several months. Thompson reflected on the lessons learned during their frozen ordeal in the Ardennes forest. Modern warfare demanded not only courage and training, but also the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, maintain unit cohesion under extreme stress, and continue fighting effectively even when traditional command structures had broken down. The American soldier of 1944 had proven capable of meeting all these challenges and more. Looking toward the window of the hospital ward, Thompson could see Allied supply convoys moving steadily eastward toward the front lines, carrying the men and materials needed for the final assault into Germany itself. The Battle of the Bulge was ending, but the larger war continued, and Thompson was determined to return to duty as soon as his injuries healed, sufficiently to allow him to serve once again with the men who had become his brothers in the frozen foxholes of Belgium. March 15th, 1945, brought news that would forever change the course of world history. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine River and were advancing rapidly into the heart of Germany, meeting minimal resistance from demoralized Wehrmacht units that had been shattered by months of continuous fighting since the failure of the Ardennes offensive. Sergeant Thompson, now fully recovered from his injuries and serving with a replacement unit of the 1st Infantry Division, stood on the banks of the Rhine and reflected on the journey that had brought him from the frozen forests of Belgium to the threshold of final victory in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge had ended in complete strategic victory for the Allied forces, but the cost had been measured in more than just casualties and destroyed equipment. An entire generation of young Americans had been tested in the crucible of winter warfare, emerging with a deeper understanding of both their own capabilities and the true nature of the conflict they were fighting. Thompson knew that he and his surviving comrades would carry the memories of those frozen December days for the rest of their lives. Reports from intelligence officers revealed the full scope of what the German offensive had attempted to accomplish. Hitler's plan, codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, had envisioned splitting the British and American armies, capturing the vital port of Antwerp, forcing the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace that would allow Germany to concentrate all remaining resources against the advancing Soviet forces in the East. The failure of this plan had sealed Germany's fate and guaranteed unconditional surrender. Within months, the human stories emerging from the battle were equally remarkable. Private First Class Joseph Martinez of the 82nd Airborne Division had single-handedly held off an entire German company for over 6 hours, allowing his unit to withdraw to safety. Technical Sergeant William Johnson of the 4th Armored Division had continued fighting despite being wounded 3 times. Personally, destroying 2 German tanks with bazooka fire during the advance toward Bastogne. Hundreds of similar acts of courage, large and small, had combined to create the victory that now seemed inevitable. Thompson's own Silver Star citation, awarded for his leadership during the 10-day ordeal behind enemy lines, seemed almost inadequate when measured against the scope of what had been accomplished. Yet he understood that every individual contribution, no matter how small it might seem, had played a vital role in the larger victory. The frozen foxholes where he and his men had waited and watched had been just one small piece of a vast puzzle that ultimately spelled defeat for Hitler's Third Reich, as referenced in the comprehensive official history, the Ardennes Battle of the Bulge by Hugh Cole. The strategic implications of the German defeat extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Europe and ensuring The post-war world would be shaped by American and Soviet influence, rather than continued German aggression. The lessons learned during the Battle of the Bulge would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. The importance of maintaining unit cohesion under extreme stress, the value of small unit leadership at all levels, and the necessity of adequate winter equipment and training became standard elements of military planning. More importantly, the battle had proven that American citizen soldiers, properly led and motivated, could overcome seemingly impossible odds through courage, determination, and unshakable belief in their cause. Thompson watched as engineers completed construction of a pontoon bridge across the Rhine, enabling the rapid movement of men and supplies into Germany itself. The war in Europe would end within weeks, but the memory of the Ardennes would endure as a testament to the price of freedom and the courage required. To defend it, standing beside the Rhine on that spring day in 1945, Thompson understood that he had witnessed and participated in one of the defining moments of the 20th century. The frozen forests of Belgium had tested an entire generation of Americans and found them equal to the challenge, ensuring that democracy would survive to face whatever challenges the future might bring. This account of the Battle of the Bulge draws upon official military records, veteran interviews, and comprehensive historical studies to present an authentic portrayal of one of the most significant battles in American military history. The experiences described reflect the collective memory of thousands of soldiers who served with distinction during those crucial weeks in the winter of 1944 and 45,